unlike Ron, I can't bring a lovely Texas twang to my recitation of a brief passage of one of Woody's columns. I'm from Pittsburgh, and it's just not quite the same, but I'll try to give you a sense of his non-traditional spelling and grammar to impart that idea of folk wisdom as I read here. Little boys and girls used to learn how to play the piano, or blow a horn, or pick a guitar, or dance. And they was openings for talented folks, because they was needed almost everywheres. But electric phonographs and radios and talkies has fixed it to where you put a nickel in, and one or two musicians entertains hundreds and thousands of people, and whole armies of well-talented folks goes a-beggin'. Used to be, when a musician walked into a saloon, he was cinched to make a good steak, because he was welcome. Nowadays, the bartender says, "No music wanted. We got Bang Crosby over there on the electric phonograph." And the crowd roars, and the musician sleeps under a bridge. And Woody was right. It has been estimated that in the late 1920s, as many as 20,000 musicians lost their livelihood, primarily those who had performed live in movie theaters to accompany silent films, men and women whose labor was now replaced by the recorded movie soundtracks of the talkies. And broadcast radio, especially stations that played records on air, displaced additional musicians from performing gigs over the course of the 1930s. But Woody was in Los Angeles, one city where work for musicians still abounded. There was work in the film studios, producing the soundtracks that had displaced all those far-flung theater performers. And there was work in LA on radio, too. Indeed, Woody and his cousin Jack found work on air as singing cowboys at station KFVD not long after Woody arrived. Perhaps because he was in LA then, Woody didn't focus his interest in workers' lives and workers' rights upon his fellow musicians, even though he was clearly aware of their plight. Instead, he packed up his guitar and hit the road, heading off to California's Central Valley, where the straitened circumstances of agricultural laborers probably seemed more familiar to a troubadour in exile from the dusty fields of Oklahoma and Texas. He sung of and to those workers' troubles, and he troubled the situation through his sounds, calling America's attention to their plight. But sound was troubling the labor situation back in Los Angeles, nonetheless. Indeed, ever since the talkies had arrived, work in the motion picture studios had been disrupted by sound. When the new recording engineers arrived on the sets, men from the telephone and radio industries, they upset the studio's balance of power, wielding their sonic expertise as a tool that effectively, if only briefly, seized the megaphone of power from the hands of tyrannical directors. Once Hollywood had recalibrated its production procedures to make the new sound movies, order was restored on the set. But the troubling power of sound only spread out from that point of origin, and labor unrest followed the talkies trail from Los Angeles to towns and cities across America where the sound movies were heard. Musicians protested their technological unemployment, but to no avail. Strikes and boycotts occurred in several cities around 1930, but none were successful, as moviegoers seemed happy to forego local live performance for the recorded studio scores, or, as Woody put it, the crowd roars and the musician sleeps under the bridge. Projectionists, however, were equally implicated in the transition to sound movies, and here the trouble persisted throughout the 1930s. The troubling effect of sound spread out in ways that were propelled by organized labor and amplified by organized crime. These problems would echo back to Los Angeles around the time that Woody arrived there in 1937. The early period of sound movies, if bad for theater musicians, was good for theater projectionists. Many talkies in the late 1920s had their soundtracks recorded not on the film itself, but on separate, synchronized phonograph discs. Projectionists thus took on the new responsibility of wrangling discs as well as changing reels. Many became adept at adjusting volume levels, restoring synchronization when a record skipped a groove, and even constructing soundtracks to accompany silent movies by jockeying discs of music and sound effects up in the booth like a modern DJ. Their union, the International Alliance of Theatrical and Stage Employees, or IATSE as it was known, leveraged these new responsibilities into higher pay for projectionists, as well as a general adoption of the two-man rule, whereby two men would be on duty in the booth at all times to share the work and to ensure the public's safety due to the inflammable nature of motion picture film. By 1931, union projectionists in Chicago were making between $90 and $175 per week, very good pay at that time. But the high pay of projectionists caught the attention of unscrupulous men, and a number of local IATSE chapters across the nation were taken over by men primarily interested not in motion picture projection, but in the money to be made through and from organized labor. These men began to assess their members heavy fees in addition to union dues, and the locals were soon rife with cash. So Woody's mention in his column of phonographed with the T at the end, while probably intended simply as a folksy mispronunciation, was in fact a sadly accurate term for describing the political economy of movie sound work in the early 1930s. As theater owners struggled with high costs in a declining economy, many began to push back against the union's two-man rule in an attempt to save money. In Chicago in 1931, such owners faced off against Tommy Malloy, president of the local IATSE chapter of projectionists. Malloy was under indictment for conspiracy to extort, and he was also a suspect in the murder of Jacob Kaufman, a union projectionist who had been about to testify to the grand jury against Malloy. During this labor impasse, there were 14 bombings of theater properties, and one evening, an incendiary device, as the papers called it, was flung into the audience of the Colony Theater during a show, burning 2 men and causing 800 patrons to flee in panic. New York City was also riven with violence. The New York local was led by Sam Kaplan, a greedy gangster who carried a pearl-handled revolver and surrounded himself with bodyguards at all times. Kaplan claimed that he had raised projectionist wages beyond the dreams of union members, but he also raised his own salary beyond almost anyone's wildest dreams, from $250 a year to $21,000. Kaplan's henchmen in the union additionally voted him annual gifts of appreciation that grew to $25,000 in 1930. When the rank-and-file projectionist Nathaniel Dorogoff brought suit against Kaplan, demanding an accounting of the chapter's annual income of $1 million, Dorogoff was simply expelled from the union. 9 fellow members who protested his expulsion were subsequently fined hundreds of dollars, beaten up, and threatened with worse. Other projectionists in New York, perhaps realizing the futility of reform, organized a rival union called the Empire State Motion Picture Operators Association. When theater owners in New York began to employ these men at lower wages and without the two-man rule, more bombings were the result. Each union blamed its rival for the violence, and the police were unable to determine who was responsible. Most of these incidents were minor, with bottles of phosphorus being tossed into theater lobbies after hours, but some were thrown from balconies into packed houses, as it happened in Chicago. In September of 1932, the police commissioner of New York City placed patrolmen in every theater in Brooklyn in an attempt to stem the violence there. That same month, in the Bronx, a can packed with 22 sticks of dynamite was discovered in the projection booth at the Lowe's Paradise Theater. According to the New York Times, this bomb was made of a type of dynamite so powerful that its use was forbidden in the city, even for demolition work. It failed to ignite because of a defective fuse, and the Times reported that if it had exploded, it would not only have killed the 3,000 people in attendance at the Paradise that night, but probably would have taken out the entire city block. So this really is domestic terrorism on the same scale as 9/11. IATSE's central administrators finally stepped into the fray and removed Kaplan from office at the end of 1932. Soon thereafter, he was convicted of coercion and sentenced to serve 6 months in jail. In Chicago, Tommy Malloy's career ended a few years later, not with a conviction, but rather in a hail of rival gunfire. But the difficult problems of sound workers in the film industry were far from over. The field of action would now return to the West Coast and to the studios where the sounds were made.